We are going to be talking now about scientific uncertainty about technological harms. This is a question of what we should do if there's a certain technology that poses a potential harm, but we are uncertain about the extent of the harm is, about the probability of the harm. And this is a question that faces a lot of new technologies. What should scientists do? What should we do if the evidence is incomplete or if scientists are divided about a certain harm? There are many reasons we could be uncertain about a certain harm, but one of them could be we just don't have the evidence, so the evidence is incomplete. Or there is evidence, but scientists are genuinely divided about the harm. And when I say genuinely divided, it's not an artificial controversy. Scientists are divided, or scientific bodies, so the Canadian Health Association and the American Health Association disagree. All right, how should we respond if things like cell phone carcinogenicity or fracking toxicity are uncertain? So how should we respond if we're uncertain? And then about the challenger, what should we do if the data is incomplete about the chances of the challenger exploding? So in a key moment in the documentary, the scientists say that they have concerns that the Challenger will explode because of the fuel will bypass the first safety valve and the second and ignite because of the temperature. But their data is incomplete, so they can't prove it. So what should you do if your data is incomplete? Do you go ahead or do you err on the side of safety? Who should bear the burden of proof in such situations? I will maintain that if NASA had different default rules about risk under conditions of uncertainty, the Challenger accident wouldn't have happened. Okay, so here's some definitions. What do we mean by uncertainty? Well, it is a technical term here. And it means that we are completely ignorant about the probability of an outcome. So we can't assign certainty is that we are 100% sure about an outcome. What is risk? Well, when we talk about risk, it means that we have reliable probabilistic knowledge about an outcome. So with a coin flip, we don't know what the outcome will be, but it's a risk, it's a gamble if you're betting on heads or tails. But you have reliable probabilistic knowledge that your chance is 50-50. Similarly, we could say with air pollution levels at X amount, particles per million, we will have Y% of hospitalizations and Z% of deaths due to asthma and other lung conditions. So you can predict that sort of outcome if you have an understanding of risk. And then finally, a default rule is the rule specifying who has the burden of proof and who should be assumed correct in the absence of arguments to the contrary. There's a default rule in our criminal justice system in criminal cases that someone is innocent until proven guilty. So the prosecutor has the burden of proof. There we go. Okay, so this is the part that gets confusing because we're talking about there's like double, triple, quadruple negatives in these sentences. So I'm just going to define these things. If you get confused reading the chapter, just remember that the author's position is that we ought to err on the side of caution in regards to exposing people to risk or exposing people to harm. Okay, or risk of harm. So a false positive is, for example, the pregnancy test says you're pregnant, but the test is wrong. So it gives you a positive pregnant result, but it's false, it's wrong. A false negative is, it's a mistake about a negative result. So the test says you aren't pregnant, but the test is wrong. COVID, a false negative would be you have COVID, but the test says you don't. So it's wrong. It's a false negative. So interestingly, you might want to ask, well, given public health concerns, should COVID tests have a false negative or false positive bias? A false negative is worse than a false positive in that case. Why? Because if the test says that you don't have COVID when you do, you could go around and spread it to a bunch of people. Okay, a false positive about harm. So it's a mistake. So this is just getting a little more specific. So what's a false positive in cases of harm, not pregnancy? Okay, it's a mistake about the presence of a harm. Whether a test is a false positive or false negative depends on what you're testing for. Okay, so in this case, what we're testing for is a harm. And a false positive is the false assertion of a harmful effect. So the test says the substance is harmful, but it's not. The test says the plane will blow up, but it doesn't. Okay, a false negative about harm is a mistake about the safety of a thing. So it says something is safe or harmless when it's not. All right, so going back, I have here, so science has a default of minimizing false positives. So that's kind of the goal of science, or how science is oriented. It would be ideal to minimize both kinds of mistakes, but you can't always do this. The scientist usually attaches a greater loss to accepting a falsehood than to failing to acknowledge a truth. Scientists don't want to go around claiming things that aren't the case. Something that's false into the body of scientific knowledge is a worse thing to do than to be slow to say something is true. But also scientific methodologies are skeptical in nature. So experimental studies are designed to guard against confounders and alternate possible causes. Studies are supposed to be replicated. There's a peer review system. People tend to be skeptical of cases without controls. So epidemiological studies, they're done on. Okay, so that really makes sense for research science, but applied science is a little different. So what Shrader-Frechette says is, I've paraphrased it, when a person moves, or when we move from basic scientific research, and this is sort of research in a lab, to policy relevant science and technology. So we're talking about applied science. We aren't just concerned with having true beliefs anymore. So the research scientist who's publishing in a journal, and they're not talking about public policy, they're just trying to figure out, I don't know, how vitamin D works, and they're publishing about this, okay? Their goal is truth, and their default rule is a good one, right? But when we start talking about, when we are talking about policy relevant science, or applied science and technologies, we aren't just concerned with having true beliefs. We are concerned about that still, but that now there's ethical dimensions involved. Okay. So here's the default rule that Shrader-Frechette is recommending, that when we're uncertain about risks to others or the general public, we ought to default to minimizing false negatives. So in other words, we should minimize the tendency to say that a product is safe when it isn't. And let me just clarify this. I was emphasizing the end of this sentence, and it might have been misconstrued. This is when we're uncertain about the risk or the harms to the general public. So it's not like we're lying. Of course, we shouldn't say, oh yeah, this product is safe, when we know that it isn't, okay? This is when we have no idea. The evidence is mixed. We just don't have good enough information. Maybe scientists are on a different side, okay? We should err on the side of caution in terms of not putting the general public at risk when we don't know. There are potentially catastrophic societal risks. There are absence of overarching benefits. There is an impossibility of avoiding both false positives and false negatives, and there is an absence of compelling arguments to the contrary. Okay, so I put these conceptual terms in italics. She does not define what a catastrophic societal risk is, an overarching benefit, or a compelling argument to the contrary. But these do indicate that there are certain conditions under which the default rule would not apply. Here is the moral argument for the default rule, the better safe than sorry. We have a stronger right not to be harmed than we do to be benefited. So most of us have this intuition that in most cases, it's worse for us to harm someone than for us to fail to benefit them. So when someone trips us or punches us, trips us on purpose or punches us, they have violated our rights, they have crossed our boundaries, and that seems much worse than if they fail to do something nice for us. So one is more violating than the other. Shrader-Frechette points out that citizens have legal rights to protection against scientific commercial decisions that could threaten their welfare, whereas the risk imposers don't have rights to the profits from any, so they don't have a legal right to profits, while citizens have a legal right to protection. So again, we have this a stronger right not to be harmed than we do to be benefited. Another thing to point out here is main reason we have government at all is to protect us. So some people think that that is the first duty of government is that we be protected from others. So, for example, Hobbes says that we have given up certain freedoms and consented to the rule of law or the rule of the government in exchange for protection from others. And then here's some other reasons. So given our democratic processes, we should not impose risks on others without their free informed consent. So people who are harmed by technology or new technology or sciences should also be the people who benefit, but usually this isn't the way things work. So usually, shareholders benefit from, certain technologies, and the people that are harmed by pollution or the side effects of the new technology are not the ones who get rich off of it. And then special interest science is already predisposed to downplay any sort of harms of the products. If you have a default rule that protects the public, that says it from possible risks when the risks are uncertain. So a default rule that works in the opposite direction is a good idea. Okay, so I claim that if NASA had a different default rule, given the uncertainty they had about the data of the O-rings failing, then the Challenger accident would not have happened. And think about what this means. So specifically, what rule could NASA have had in place to keep this from happening?